me again. I just want to acknowledge the awkwardness of doing podcasts solo. I'm so used to conversations. It's different in a way that's challenging, but in a good way. It's surprisingly good for self-authority. I'm not sure what the noun is. Edification? Something like that. And as a Libra rising, an unusual one at that, when people think Libra rising as opposed to Libra sun, they might think caretaking tendencies or relational soothing. Common misunderstanding with Libra rising. Libra risings tend to have issues with keying off of other people to find themselves, and that's exactly something I'm working on these days in the domain of self-authority, one of the themes that all of this is about. So having no one to talk to, for the moment anyway, it slows me down, as you notice, and makes me find a deeper place to bring the words from. Yeah, it's interesting. So I just also wanted to say I'm still getting over a hump in recording these podcasts because, related to what I was saying, having someone to talk to key off of, I've always got things to say. But to self-generate in this way, there's still an aspect of me that's like, I don't know what to say. What's the moment calling for? What's the situation? What's the other eliciting out of me? And I don't have that in this moment. So it's a cool experiment. I notice myself pushing off the recording of these podcasts and waiting for some increased clarity about what it is I'm going to say. And then finally I just realized I need to hit record and just start talking. That worked well enough the first time, and I trust it'll work well enough today. So I have a few ideas about what I wanted to cover today. One is sort of by request, a reasonable one. And I've got a few notes here. Just sort of a housekeeping issue, if you will. I want people to know that I did send the Yin as Essence manuscript to the founders of Identity, and all of the facilitators saw it before it was released to the public. I felt that was, not just felt, thought and felt that was a necessary gesture of respect, and to give people an opportunity to respond, to give the leaders of the paradigm an opportunity to respond to the critique. And related to that, one of the things I want to talk about today is that I've not yet received a response, a mental or structural response to the critique. I've received some emotional ones. I've received no response really whatsoever from the founders, and I won't go into the various facilitators, but not a substantive critique of the critique. And I want to talk about that today because it's only been a week and a day or two since I released this publicly, and I'll link the document in the show notes again in this episode. But I want to talk about how to respond to a critique in the domain that it exists. So, because this is not commonly understood. For those of you who are educated in the humanities, certainly in law, if you are a history major, an English major, sociology, psychology, these kinds of domains, then you're trained in college to be able to make a case, to be able to make an argument. And that's not something that necessarily happens in the sciences. I don't think so, not in the same way. They're different kinds of cases. And so because of that, I think a lot of people think they know how to make a strong case and respond to a strong case, but it's a blind spot for them, innocently, understandably. Rhetoric and debate, it's something we really should learn in high school, but we mostly don't. And it's incidental, depending on the subject in college, but largely incidental in our education. So a few things about that. So the Yin as Essence document is a structural critique that stands or falls on internal coherence. That's the nature of a mental body-based critique. Is it internally coherent? Does it make sense? And what it asks for is engagement at the same level of analysis. You don't have to agree with or like the outcome. And just because you don't agree with or like the outcome doesn't mean there's something wrong with the critique. And let me give you an example of that. So most of the document was written in about 2 weeks. And then for about a week or two afterward, I added things as they came to me, maybe a little bit, half a page every day or every other day, as the information started to sort of trickle instead of flood like it was. And one morning after week 2, I was putting away dishes and waking up, clearing my head. And I had already discovered that the Enneagram, surely the greatest personality typing system there is, as far as I've discovered, the most sophisticated personality typing system there is, clearly Myers-Briggs and DISC and all of the other ones are clearly derivative of the Enneagram. And I'd been learning astrology. And I said, I wonder if all Enneagram aspects, I knew a little bit about Enneagrammatic aspects being accounted for in astrology, but I hadn't looked that deeply. So I had already discovered that the Enneagram is accounted for in astrology in a way that renders the Enneagram a kind of abbreviation or a shorthand that I think is still useful, but I don't hold the Enneagram as essential anymore. And I don't mean essential in the way of like really useful. I mean essential as non-derivative. Did I do too many knots in that sentence? I'm saying the Enneagram is derivative. It's not like the humerus and the ulna are, real bones in your arm. The Enneagram is an abbreviation. It's derivative of astrology. Astrology accounts for Enneagram and a whole lot more. So I had already discovered that. And that didn't make me, I didn't have a strong reaction to that because the Enneagram still is useful. Like I said, it's a shorthand. It sums things up. It's a good way to get a picture of someone. But when someone is hard to Enneagram type, the answer is in the chart. Stop trying to put them in an Enneagram box. The answer is in the chart. They don't neatly fit into a derivative system. Case closed. Solves a lot of problems. So there I am putting dishes away. And I had the thought, what if astrology can account for soul species? And I got kind of a chill and nausea. It didn't feel good. But I was curious at the same time. So I started playing around with looking at some charts, and you'll see in the Yin as Essence document, there's a section where I look at Donald Trump's chart as a classic Geffian soul, as identity would call it. And I go work through the chart and show how all of the Geffian qualities are accounted for in the chart quite well, quite strongly. And I think I also look at I talk about Raphaelites and the chart indications that cause that, and maybe one or two others. So I did it enough to make a case that soul species is, for all purposes, a derivative system. And I want to share that with you because I was not happy about it. As people who've been listening to this podcast for a while know, I was a huge fan of soul species. I was probably the second best after Stace at identifying soul species. I made that slideshow that's hundreds of slides. I was heavily invested in the soul species system. I thought about it a lot. When I looked at people, I would see the soul species, half the time or more. And so that was an emotionally, upset is a little bit of a strong word, but it was an emotionally unfortunate discovery that I was not happy about. And it was a bit cognitively dissonant. And I'm still catching myself when I look at people and my mind says, oh, they're this soul species, to sort of shake it off and go, wait, I'm not using that model anymore. And I can't remember if I said this last time. I don't think I did in the last podcast, but forgive me if I'm repeating myself. The question is not whether soul species is true as a model. That's less important. What's important is what is the price that gets paid for mythology in a model? Because soul species is not a replicatable experience. What I would say soul species is, again, I'm being agnostic about it. I don't know if it's true, but how it appears to me is it's a true form of energetic pattern recognition that is accounted for in astrology. So someone with strong Mars and strong Saturn influences in their chart that are cut off from their internal emotional world and don't process reality emotionally in any significant way is likely to look like a Geffian. And that gives off an energetic pattern that you can recognize in the eyes and the energetic field. And then we can call that Geffian. But then the mythology after that isn't necessary, nor is it as descriptive of the phenomena as astrology is. And I go into this argument more deeply in the document, the general point being that if you can account for phenomena with a model that explains more with less contradictions and doesn't require belief, then that's just a better model. It's the same reason we use a periodic table of the elements instead of the ancient idea that everything is made of earth, fire, air, and water. Is it true that when you burn wood, the result is ash and smoke? And thousands of years ago, they said, see, the wood was made of earth and air, and you burn it, and it releases some earth in the form of ash, and the smoke is the air. Well, that was a model, right? But when they started to understand with a greater level of complexity that the wood is made of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and whatever else, nitrogen, I think. And when you burn it, it breaks it up into these component parts. The smoke is carbon dioxide and whatever else, carbon monoxide, and the ash is, I don't know what it is, carbon something. And here we can demonstrate that by taking the ash and adding this acid to it and turning it into whatever. It's just a more compelling model that explains more. So what do you do with the less compelling model? You discard it. And so that's what I'm doing with soul species. And again, I'm not pleased about that. Soul species is a beautiful model, one that I operated with for almost 20 years. And there's another thing right here that I wanted to speak to, because I'm sure some people are wondering, Joseph, what is going on with you? You've made this sudden, irrevocable shift in your thinking. And that's true. And I'm surprised about it too. So, what model explains that? How do we understand that? Because in the realm of identity, it would be extremely tempting to assume or assert that such a rapid change of heart and mind would be a trigger related, resistance, or some other nefarious expression of a protector, or all of the above. That would be what the model would preliminarily assert. And interestingly, this is something I've been looking at in myself, because it's been an old experience for me that when I make a shift in thinking, that it happens fast. So I got curious about why that was. By the way, I don't experience it so much. Sometimes I do, but I don't experience it as fast. I mostly experience that other people are slow. That's just a typical projection. But what accounts for it, interestingly, is in my astrological chart. I have Mercury and Gemini in the 9th house, conjunct Saturn. And you can ask an astrologer, or you can give this to GPT, and it will confirm that configuration causes people to think in terms of first principles. And when a foundational first principle shifts, it structurally redraws everything. And the Saturn influence, that's the Mercury in 9th. 9th is the house of philosophy, dharma, higher learning. In Gemini, gives it an extra agility and strength in that way. Mercury is happy in Gemini. And conjunct Saturn adds authority, structure, and all of that combines to, when I see something in a new way, it becomes like I never saw it any differently, which can be difficult because it's hard to remember when I was in a different view. So there's a great example. So we have two models. You, of course, can make up your mind however you want. You can decide that this shift in my perspective is inauthentic and structurally wound-based, based on a trigger. How could somebody suddenly change their perspective so quickly? But I would offer that the better explanation is accounted for by the astrology. And then there's an important thing there, because without that astrological explanation, it would be very tempting to moralize and judge how someone could make a change of mind and heart that quickly. That's just the nature of me. It doesn't mean that's better than someone who doesn't. It just means that's how I roll. And that's a level of understanding and acceptance of the differences in human beings that I don't think identity has made room for. And while I'm on this subject, a personality typing system like Myers-Briggs has 16 different possibilities. There's, like INFJ, that one. I think that's what I am, INFJ. I don't know Myers-Briggs very well, but I know there's, for the 4 letters, there's 2 options, and that creates, if I'm getting that right, it creates a total of 16 possible personalities. Pretty good. You can learn it pretty quickly. It sums things up pretty well. Compared to the Enneagram, it's derivative, though. Enneagram has 9 types with 2 wing possibilities. That's 18. And then 18 times 3, which is a number I really should memorize, 54. The 3 is instinctual variance, sexual, social, self-pres. So Enneagram has 54 really solid different types, more sophisticated than Myers-Briggs? Well, when you look at Vedic astrology, you got 12 houses, 9 planets, 12 signs, and then you multiply that times 2.5 for the moon nakshatras. That gets you to just under 3,000. And when I saw that, I was impressed, because that's a lot of different types. That means that from Vedic astrology's perspective, the Enneagram is pigeonholing people into boundaries that are way too tight for them. The same way the Enneagram would say that about Myers-Briggs. The same way Myers-Briggs would say that about DISC, another even simpler personality typing system. So I don't think I've finished. I went a little astray here. I didn't finish the stuff I want to talk about with structural arguments, but that was maybe some good explication about structure. So I just briefly made a case. Again, the case is bigger in the manuscript, but I'm talking about structure here. So when I say that astrology can account for, just right off the bat, without even going into the sophisticated parts of it, can account for almost 3,000 different personality typing systems, and the Enneagram can do 54. That's a structural argument. So someone might say, well, I like the Enneagram better. Okay, you can do that. Well, the Enneagram feels more natural to me. Okay, you can say that. But those are not structural arguments. Those are not structural responses. So you're free to have whatever opinions you want, but if I make the case that astrology is structurally more equipped to meet people where they are and less likely to pigeonhole them, approximate them, moralize them into categories that are too tight for their essence, that demands a structural argument. And this is a form of category rigor. So, like I said before, I've not received any structural arguments against the Yin as Essence document. I would be very curious to hear them. What I have heard is, that's not my experience. You're right. The basis of my argument is that I don't think that we're structurally emotional beings first. And here's why, and here's what that does, and here are the problems with that assumption. Pulls it apart in lots of different ways. Listening to all that, or reading 215 pages about that, and saying, well, that's not my experience. That's not a structural substantive argument. It's completely outside of structure and mind. And of course, like I said, you can have that response, but it's a categorical error. Your experience, your emotions, your intuition are different domains than the mental argument. I'm not saying you can't have those. I'm just saying they don't apply. You're free to guide yourself with whatever developmental line you want. But I'm just saying that's not an actual argument. And this is important because one of the effects of privileging the emotional line structurally, like identity does, is it causes what I call indulgence. And it will, because the assertion is we're emotional beings first, structurally, that privileges emotion in a way that people often interpret to mean that their emotion about something has more weight, more substance than a mental response. And it depends on the situation. It depends on what's happening. It may or may not. And that's the art of living right there. But this was one of the things I pointed out in the Yin and Service document when I was starting to get like I said in the last time, those were the symptoms of the yin as essence fallacy, I was starting to get the sense of this issue. So emotional responses and relational reframing, that's another domain. Relationality is a different domain than emotional. Like someone saying how I've impacted them with the yin as essence manuscript. If that hurts or is disorienting or confusing, it's not that those things aren't legitimate. Those are relational or emotional responses, but they have nothing to do with the argument. And that's categorical rigor. In the same way that the mood your plumber is in should not affect the competence of their work for you. And when they leave after an hour and a half and your faucet is still leaking, and they say, well, I tried my best, but I'm just having a hard day. You don't care, right? You paid them the money. They should fix the leak. It's a category drift. It's a categorical error. So I'm interested in structural responses if people have them, but I just want to name this issue because I've heard some of it and I anticipate more. Is there anything else I want to say about that? There's a few more things. There are the best arguments, best is in quotes there, against my critique would include, one would be like, well, all paradigms are internally coherent, so debating them is pointless. And there's truth to that, and it sounds very sophisticated, but it sidesteps the actual question. Because internal coherence is not the same as adequacy. A model can be internally consistent and still produce systemic distortions. So the question is not whether a paradigm makes sense on its own terms, but whether its core assumptions generate problems, unnecessary harm, dependency, developmental arrest over time, which is what I'm asserting identity does. So because I'm asserting that identity helps people the same way gambling entertains people, it does that. And there's a hidden long-term cost that goes against what the promise is. And I would say that demands response. Another common move that I expect to hear is, well, we're just starting from different assumptions. I'm starting from a different premise, that there are 7 developmental lines that we're not structurally emotion first. So we're starting from different assumptions, that Joseph is going in a new direction, a different direction. That's true, but it's incomplete. Different assumptions are not automatically equivalent. Some assumptions require more compensatory mechanisms than others. Some assumptions siphon authority away from individuals and store it in myth, hierarchy, special insights. Other assumptions do not. So a structural critique evaluates assumptions by their consequences, not by their elegance or appeal. And that's what I did. The critique evaluates the assumptions by their consequences. Another move is to appeal to outcomes. People are better off than when they started, would be a defense of identity. And there are a lot of newer people in identity now that have not been in it long enough to experience the downsides. So it may be true that people are better than when they started, and it may be that identity is working for you. That doesn't invalidate that. But that experience doesn't answer the critique. Improvement does not mean optimal development. Many systems help people evolve while limiting how far they're able to go at the same time. A structural critique asks whether the ceiling is built into the model itself. So saying it's working for me, it's worked for the last 2 years, that's not a response to the argument. You can think that, you can have that experience, but it's not a response to the argument. Another move would be to say that the paradigm is evolving. Again, possibly true, but evolution only happens when core premises are open to revision. If certain assumptions are treated as untouchable, then what's evolving is surface, not structure. And so when I first started writing the Yin as Essence critique, I imagined that maybe identity could evolve into this. I even hoped that, and that their identity could be evolved into a larger paradigm with a revision of one of its 3 principles, as I discussed last time, changed. And then the more I saw the ramifications, the less hope I had that it could do that. Well, by it, I mean the people who are heavily invested in the original premises. Because it's a demand for a lot of change. I understand that. But if we can't question the core premises of any paradigm, then we're in a belief system. And then continuing the paradigm, continuing the subscription, continuing the beliefs becomes more important than the actual reality, the data, the experience. And that goes against what identity is fundamentally supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about getting in reality. It's supposed to be a model that we constantly question. Well, I wrote a 215-page question. And it's my truth that it demands a response. But people are free to respond to that structural critique with a structural critique, with a mental critique, or not. I'm just telling you from the domain of mind and structure, that's what's called for. And people's, quote, experience and feelings do not apply to a mental and structural argument. It's just a different category. And to not see that is to fall prey to the feelings are more important than facts sand trap that much of our society is in. This is related to the death of critical thinking. We have to be able to look at structural and mental implications when it's not convenient for us, when it doesn't feel good. That's why I shared that thing about the soul species thing. I was not pleased about having to extract, which I still am, the soul species model out of myself. That's work. That's uncomfortable. It's occasionally disorienting. And that leads me to the main thing I wanted to talk about today, which is, I wanted to read something. So someone said to me, I wish you would talk about on the podcast what you're excited about. And I'm glad they said that, because I do take requests and I'm happy to take more. I won't receive criticism until and unless you finish the document, but I will take requests. And I added this to the end of 16.3 after this person said, I want to hear what you're excited about, and talked about the loss, the grief related to losing the mythological elements of identity, which is real. And I went through it, and still in some smaller ways, still going through it myself. And that's just part of how this is. So I'll read and riff off of it maybe. One of the most legitimate emotional responses to the arguments in this manuscript is grief. Not intellectual disagreement, but sadness. The loss is not abstract, but also should not be mistaken for a counterargument, which would be a categorical error. I was just talking about that. A categorical error of what identity calls a truth in service. It is the loss of magic, of specialness, of being seen as an old soul, an angel soul, or a participant in a story larger than oneself. It is the loss of a shared mythological field that offered belonging, recognition, and a sense of being known at a depth that ordinary life rarely provides. This loss deserves to be taken seriously. It is not trivial, and is not something to be waved away solely with appeals to rationality or correctness. The question this manuscript raises has never been whether soul species, soul age, or similar mythological structures are true in some metaphysical sense. The question is whether they are necessary for human development and what their long-term developmental costs may be. Deconstructive work inevitably removes something people were leaning on. When mythological structures are withdrawn, what disappears first is often not meaning, but enchantment. The feeling of being part of something special gives way to something quieter and less immediately gratifying. For many, this feels like diminishment, and I'm going through this process as well. What is easy to miss in that moment is what is gained. This is the category of what there is to be excited about. Because in the role I'm in right now, it's very easy to curse the darkness but not light a candle. So this is some of the candle, and there's more. It's in the manuscript and in the piece I'm writing that will probably come out later in the year, fall or winter. There's going to be a lot more light, but right now we have to wade through the deconstruction process. So let me go back to the reading now. What is easy to miss in that moment is what is gained. What replaces mythological reassurance is not emptiness, but sobriety and self-authority. The trade is not magic for meaninglessness. The trade is magic for responsibility and symbolism for structure. What becomes possible once mythology no longer carries the burden of significance is a form of depth that does not depend on being special in order to be meaningful. The very depth that identity promised but has not been able to deliver while it mythologically elevates while siphoning self-authority. A mature human being does not require metaphysical elevation to experience significance. Let me say that again. A mature human being, I'm asserting, does not require metaphysical elevation to experience significance, which is what the soul species model does. You can say, I'm off the script here, I'm off the book. You can say angel souls are no better than any other soul, but is that really what comes across? Is that really how people hold it? They're the most porous, the most sensitive, the most spiritual, the most wise. They have the greatest capacity, but they're not any better than the more dense souls. Do you really buy that? You can experience yourself, if you know the soul species model well, as I have, and as I do, when you drop it and start looking without that lens and start to see like, oh, we're all just built differently. You can feel the metaphysical elevation drop away, and the sobriety and groundedness comes. And there's also an enormous freedom to become more dense, more efficacious, to have the advantages of the, quote, denser souls. Because if you look in people's astrological charts, very often that's actually indicated as a vector for development. It depends. But soul species nounifies in ways that actually limit people, is my case. Let me go back to the writing here. I'm about halfway through. A mature human being does not require metaphysical elevation to experience significance. Meaning arises through contact with reality as it is lived, not as it is narrated. That's the mythology, the narration. Development itself becomes meaningful when it is no longer outsourced to stories about who one essentially is. That's the outsourcing of self-authority. Emotional maturity, ethical responsibility, authority, restraint, and care acquire weight because they are enacted rather than explained. As the founder himself has said many times, the authentic self doesn't watch themselves because they are too busy being it. Unquote. Being doesn't require any narratives of mythology that are not immediately and readily experienceable in fact. Such narratives inhibit authenticity, create separation from others, and unnecessarily exclusivizes the work. Mythology and self-authority do not coexist easily. Mythological frameworks, even benevolent ones, tend to siphon authority away from the individual by placing meaning upstream of lived capacity. They answer the question of who one is before one had to become someone. Let me read that again. Mythological frameworks, even benevolent ones, tend to siphon authority away from the individual by placing meaning upstream of lived capacity. They answer the question of who one is before one had to become someone. For a time, this can be supportive. Over time, it severely limits maturation. The excitement, obviously, does not lie in tearing magic away from people. I'm not excited about that. I take no joy in that. This is an unfortunate price we all pay, if you choose to. The excitement lies in what becomes available when magic is no longer asked to do the work that only development can do. The reward is a form of depth that is quieter but more durable, less shiny but more real. It is the experience of a life that feels meaningful not because it has been named as such, but because it is being lived with clarity, responsibility, and integrity. What is enheartenment without mythology and total fidelity to direct experience, is the question 3.0 asks. What happens when identity got right, when what identity got right is expanded into a more complete curriculum for human development and does not need people to pay for their progress with self-authority? These are exciting questions, and this, in the long run, is not a loss of meaning. It is a refusal of substitution. So that's all I have for today. And if you want to read that, it's the second half of chapter 16.3 in the Yin as Essence Fallacy manuscript. I'm Joseph Shapiro. Until next time. And we are doing Second Sunday in about 2 weeks. So this will obviously be on the docket for discussion. I look forward to seeing you. Thanks for listening.